South Dakota.
Expensive. Per book costs $60.
Welcome to the third talk in our colloquium series. Today we have Dr. Edythe Weeks, who's visiting from Webster University Worldwide and Washington University in St. Louis. Dr. Weeks has a bachelor's degree in economics. She received that in 1984 and then a law degree in 1987 from the University of Missouri-Columbia. In 2006, she completed her dissertation, her PhD at Northern Arizona University, Flagstaff, Arizona. The topic of her dissertation was the politics of space law in a post-Cold War era, understanding regime change. Dr. Weeks has been creating and teaching online courses at Webster University Worldwide and Washington University in St. Louis. She teaches to social and behavioral sciences students. And without further ado, I introduce Dr. Weeks. The title of her talk, Reading Tea Leaves, Space Law and Policy, a Method for Elucidating the Next Big Thing.
Thank you. Well, it's a great honor and a privilege to be here today. I've been excited the whole day. I've been having the time of my life. And before I get started...
Your mic is off. Two buttons.
I turned both of them on. Hello, testing, testing.
Looks like it's on.
Yeah, they're both on.
You're not hearing her?
You still don't hear me?
We can swap mics.
Well, that's about the worst thing.
Too bad if that's the worst thing that happens.
That looks like Dr. Wynn.
Okay, can you hear me now? Can you hear me? Hello?
Yeah, there's two on buttons.
They're both on.
Hello? Can you hear me now? Okay, all right, okay. All right. Welcome, everybody. It's a great honor and privilege to be here. I'm excited about being here. Before I get started, I'd like to know, is someone curious about the title? Does anyone have a question about the title?
People were asking earlier about the tea leaves.
Oh, the tea leaves? Okay, can you frame that in a question for me? Thank you. What is your name?
Josh.
Josh. Josh, frame it in a question for those people, for the audience.
Tea leaves relate to the space aspect.
Okay. All right. Thank you. But you already know the answer to that, right?
I think so.
Okay. What is the answer?
Fortune telling, sort of.
How does that relate to space or space law?
Fortune telling.
Yes. Yes. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Very good. A+. Okay. I tried to come up with a catchy phrase that would give you all a signal so you would understand what I'm going to be here talking about today. Now, what I found is that by looking at laws and policies, you can anticipate things that have been placed on the agenda to occur, plans in the works, which are likely to happen in the future. It's sort of like tea leaves. I don't know much about reading tea leaves. I don't do it myself, but that was a phrase that came to mind to describe what I have been doing. I've been reading laws and politics in an attempt to try and understand, will outer space actually be put on the schedule to become developed or colonized, or will it not? What I found so far is it looks like it, okay? And I believe outer space is the next territory that's going to be developed. There's a space law expert coming later in the week So I want to distinguish the focus that I'm going to give you all as compared to what I'm anticipating she will give, okay? My focus will look at the politics involved with the processes of lawmaking. But before I can explain that, I have to explain to you what politics means. Does anyone know? Can someone give me a definition of politics?
The slow beating of boards together over time.
Yes, exactly. That's correct. Yes, that's correct. I agree with that. And boards, let's say these things are our boards, okay?
Polis, what happens in a city.
Okay, yes, that's correct. All right. Political activities, whatever you imagine those to be, laws, policies, ideologies, the way people think in large numbers, discourses, things that are written, opinions, pattern ways of speaking, pattern ideas that pop up in groupings, institutional practices, for example, what happens within the United Nations, what happens within school systems, etc. Social, economic, historical phenomena, technological phenomena, philosophical ideas, cultural practices, and psychological phenomena. Those things tend to operate in our world and in our society in various ways that result in things happening and things not happening. So when it comes to outer space being developed, there's a pattern of activities, political activities, which have shaped the making of space law and which in turn have been shaped by the making of space law, okay? So we're going to talk about those things. It's messy. It's not clear-cut. It's difficult to prove or measure in any way. But yet, it is possible, or it was possible for me, to come up with a method to explain and talk about this messy stuff. I had to because I had to defend my dissertation. And I chose to do a dissertation on the topic of outer space development. Was it going to actually happen? And if so, what proof did I have? And what direction was it likely to take? What role would the private sector be likely to play in newly emerging space industries? I decided to go back to school and pursue a PhD in international relations. I began the program in 1998, and I went there intent on trying to figure out these questions, or how do you speak in a way where then you can develop an expertise and teach and write and publish so other people knew what I was talking about. Again, it's messy. It's not clear-cut. I'm going to shift to the Prezi now. Has anyone done a Prezi before? This is my first time. Let's look at the case of space mining or asteroid mining. There are proposals in the works to begin mining asteroids as a new industry. Before this occurred, there was something called space tourism. There were discourses available online in articles, books, conference talks, titles of papers at the International Astronautical Federation Congress and other congresses centered around the question, and this was around 1999 to 2002. The question at that time was, is space tourism, or can space tourism become a legal industry? And do the international space laws prevent space tourism from occurring? And can private citizens eventually travel in and out of space? And why not? And what's happening? And why is this being restricted? Well, you all know now that's no longer a legal issue, right? It seems to have been settled somehow. I don't see this issue appearing in the discourses anymore. Spaceship One won the X Prize in 2004 The Commercial Space Launch Amendments Act was passed in 2004. Sir Richard Branson of Virgin Airlines, Virgin Records, formed a company called Virgin Galactic. Now that's combined with Spaceship One. I no longer see the question or the issues posed about whether or not it's in accordance with international space law that private space companies should be allowed or are allowed to conduct space transportation, commercial space transportation industries. So my dissertation examined space tourism, now that already seems to have occurred, space mining. We're in the process now where many discourses are arising, focusing on whether or not international space law is sufficient, whether or not this imagined legal uncertainty will prevent mining operations from occurring in outer space. Okay, so that's what I would like to talk about today. Since you are focusing on asteroid mining, I'd like to talk about the connection between space law and asteroid mining with an eye towards explaining this. There seems to be an ideological conflict right now arising in discourses when it comes to the issue of whether or not commercial space mining operations are legal. So that's what we're going to investigate That's what we're going to investigate now. Is that okay with everybody? Does that sound reasonable, practical? Okay. What about the tea leaves? Does that make sense now or no? Does it still not make sense? No, no one cares, just get on with it? Okay. You want to see the pressy? Okay, all right. So mining operations are scheduled to start soon. Visionaries are ready to create new industries at a time when there's little else.
What will tomorrow look like? Our world is at its limits. And yet we all want more. And why not? Why shouldn't the future be better than today? But where will it come from? Simple. Our tiny planet sits in a vast sea of resources, including millions of asteroids, bathed in the sun's free energy 24 hours a day. The same rocks that could fall from our skies also contain everything we could ever need, both out there and down here. It's time someone seized the opportunity. Deep Space Industries. Deep Space is a new kind of company with a new kind of plan. We don't build rockets. We don't do astronomy. We are explorers and harvesters, makers and suppliers. As they say, timing is everything. And for space, right now is the time. In fact, some of the planet's most successful people are placing their bets on this new frontier. Meanwhile, NASA and others are planning new missions to the Moon and Mars, with new space facilities in free space joining the billions of dollars worth of communication satellites already in orbit. And as they reach beyond Earth's orbit, Deep Space Industries will be there with the fuel, air, and materials they will need to succeed and grow. DSI has assembled an international team of well-known experts and young innovators who are building on our space legacy and creating new technologies and approaches to open the frontier. We will develop and prove ourselves in 3 areas: exploring and prospecting for asteroids, harvesting and returning asteroid materials, and processing those materials for use in space and on Earth. Our early systems will be small and largely off-the-shelf components re-engineered for deep space. We will hitch rides on much larger missions with multiple ways to get into space, where our job really begins. With mission costs so low, we'll be able to attract commercial sponsors and build fleets of vehicles to assure our success. Early markets will be satellites in need of fuel, government outposts and commercial facilities, and missions between the Earth and the Moon. As we gain expertise and develop our systems, we will grow them as the frontier grows, so that when the time comes, DSI will be ready. We will be the gas station, the oasis for air and water, and the building supply center for the frontier. This is a long game, perhaps the longest ever. While we earn our way, the long goal is to create a better future for all of us through space resources.
Two companies. One is Deep Space Industries, the other is Planetary Resources.
Everything we hold of value on Earth, metals, minerals, energy, water, real estate, are literally in near infinite quantities in space. Planetary Resources' mission is to gain access to the natural resources of space by mining near-Earth approaching asteroids. With technological advances that are coming out of exponential technologies and investors willing to bear the risk, small teams are now able to do what only governments and large corporations could do before. Our vision is to catalyze humanity's growth both on and off the Earth. We're breaking new ground. Now is the time for us to gain access to these resources. And at the end, the entire human race will be the beneficiary as we expand our reach beyond the Earth into the solar system.
All right. Take note of key words that appeared over and over in those discourses. Now, what are discourses? Well, that's a concept that people in the social and behavioral sciences uses to describe writings, conversations, words, slogans, commercials, lyrics and songs, pattern conversations on the phone with your friends, behavioral practices, smile patterns, elevated behavior. It includes poetry. It includes a wide range of forms of communications. Tattoos, for example, can be a form of discourse. The fact that many people now, as of the 1990s, started getting tattoos, whereas before it wasn't very common, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. If you notice, they used a lot of terms suggesting that these industries are going to benefit all people. There were images of people all around the world, etc. There's a reason for that. There are various space treaties which indicate that as space activities occur, the international community agreed that they would benefit all mankind. That was the phrase used in the 60s. Now it should be updated for humankind or something like that. But the term in the treaty is benefit all mankind. Now the perspectives. Here's how I've organized my thoughts centered around analyzing this current legal issue. The perspectives that I've been able to discern are as follows. There are what I call floating perspectives, which exist in discourses on the topic of asteroid mining, suggesting that existing space law is inadequate for this newly emerging industry. Now, I'm using the term floating perspectives. I just sort of made that up to describe what I'm seeing. In the two videos, they don't mention anything about the law specifically. However, if you were to research the issue of asteroid mining and space law, you're likely to find, as I have found, various articles posted here and there complaining that there's a concern that somehow international space law is not sufficient for planned space mining operations. I'm calling them floating perspectives because they don't seem to be grounded in any particular institution, any particular nation, or any particular nationals from one particular nation. They tend to be U.S. based or linked to a certain type of U.S. ideology. That's true. But in terms of where these perspectives are coming from, what they're grounded in, I'm just saying it's floating. So there is a perspective out there that's complaining that the international space laws are inadequate. And others tend to assert that there is uncertainty whether or not space law restricts private entities from owning outer space territories or resources. Now let's compare that with the general consensus opinion of the Board of Directors of the International Institute of Space Law. They published a statement in 2004 and again in 2009, which explicitly states that property rights are not allowable, according to international space law, for individuals, companies, corporations, institutions, and/or governmental entities. Let's take a look at that Board of Directors statement. Okay. Now this is a 2009 statement. It refers to the 2004 statement. And you can see it here. Can you all read that all right? Okay. And this is online. You can research it through the International Institute of Space Law website. And you can also research this group. They're legal experts given the authority by the international community to interpret and make opinions on matters of space law. Okay? So they're basically saying here, property rights are not allowable. Specifically, I'd like to call your attention to the last paragraph of this Board of Directors statement. They're suggesting that a specific legal regime for the exploitation of such resources should be elaborated through the United Nations on the basis of present international space law for the purposes of clarity and legal certainty in the near future. So they're saying, okay, if anyone feels that space law is inadequate, set up a meeting. We can invite all parties interested, and we can negotiate what you want to happen and compare that with other people want to happen, and we can come to some sort of an agreement. That's basically, it's an invitation to create an amendment or an addendum to international space law if that's the decision that's made by the international community. Some of the discourses complaining about the uncertainty and lack of specificity in space law, some of these discourses are complaining that this is a bad idea, that to go to the UN is a bad idea. And this is what you will find when you research this issue yourself. Or this is what you're likely to find. This is what I found. Let's take a look. Someone wants to see this 2004 director statement, so I'm going to click on it. How do I know? Professors always know. Somehow I'm not finding it. Why is that? Oh, here we go. Here we go. All right. Okay. Okay. So this one is a little different from the 2009 statement. Now keep in mind, this was passed in July of 2004, a few months before the Commercial Space Launch Amendments Act was passed in December of 2004. And I believe this statement gave Congress the confidence to move forward and pass the Commercial Space Launch Amendments Act, okay? You can research that yourself and see if I'm right, see if I'm wrong, see what you think, see what you can find. What kind of data would support such an assumption, okay? But it basically says claims to the moon being made by parties. For example, there are companies selling deeds, lunar deeds to the moon, etc. They're saying that's not legal. Those rights are not legitimate. They elaborate on an issue that was appearing. There was a conflict over whether or not Article 2 of the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, it states outer space, including the moon and other celestial bodies, is not subject to national appropriation by claim of sovereignty by means of use or occupation or by any other means. Now, some people expressed an opinion that because this refers to nations, it says basically this term national appropriation, some people interpreted that as meaning, so therefore this doesn't prevent corporations, it doesn't prevent private companies from claiming ownership rights over territories or resources. But this statement was passed to clarify that that article does apply. There's another article in the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, the Launching State Article, Article 6, which specifically holds nations responsible for any activities that companies or individuals conduct when they're launched from that nation. So the decision was made, no, Article 2 applies to everybody, okay? And this was produced in this published Board of Directors statement, okay, in 2004. However, there's what I call a caveat clause here. Note, it says, note, notwithstanding matters covered in the above statement, the Board of Directors of the IISL recognizes that other private activities on the moon and other celestial bodies are permitted, okay? I presented a paper before this, after this, and in between, pointing out how this can be perceived as a possible loophole for key actors who were looking for a loophole. So what does all this mean? What am I saying? What do these laws mean? Or do the treaties, or the treaties saying that it's permissible or not? Who are these people? Okay. This is what I mean when I say law is messy. Laws can be written, treaties can be agreed upon, ratified, signed, enacted. In the world of space law, you have international law, and then you have domestic space law. The international space laws are basically made up of 5 treaties.
The full screen button in the bottom right. Okay.
All right. Before I discuss the 5 treaties, though, I want to point out the assumptions related to the perspectives. The floating perspectives are calling for legal certainty to protect investors of the space mining operations. They are calling for an amendment or an addendum to space law that will allow private property rights so that companies and their investors will feel more confident that mining operations will not be halted after they have begun or after profits are assured. This perspective also articulates that they do not want to be forced to share a percentage or a portion of their hard-earned profits with the international community, the UN, or developing nations. Now, where am I getting this from? From a multiplicity of articles and information that I've been reading that's speaking to this perspective. I sort of summed it up. This assumes that this would be unfair for people who have not done the work and who have not taken risks associated with work and investment to enjoy the fruits of the labor that they've that they've engaged in. The general consensus within the IISL is that legal certainty can be negotiated via the UN mechanism. This assumes that the UN process will ultimately be satisfactory to all parties and that justice will prevail. This further assumes that old resentments will be buried, resolved, and/or forgotten. and not allowed to influence decision-making processes regarding equitable or equality-based distribution of the space resources, or the allocation of rights as they pertain to property rights. I'm interpreting the floating perspectives as being rooted in fears, articulated fears, that after mining begins, the international community, the UN, developing countries, will halt or cause a halt and demand a percentage of profits. But what empirical data exists that this will in fact happen? What proof is there? Are there fears that conflicts may arise, disgruntlement, hurt feelings, tensions, jealousy? Let's think about this. Who's willing to take the risk? Okay. An underlying assumption in that floating perspective is that people who take risks should be rewarded for those risks. But something to consider is, what are risks? Might we all be taking risks? Should asteroid mining projects capture asteroids and move them closer to Earth, etc.? Will that somehow make something in the orbits unstable? Will it cause more things?
Close encounters of a very different kind today on and above planet Earth. A meteor exploded over Russia this morning with the force of a nuclear bomb. And it came on the same day an asteroid was scheduled for a very intimate flyby of our third rock from the sun. We begin with Senior Foreign Affairs.
Is it possible that this can occur? Also, the NASA budget, public funds have been allocated for research and development, contracts which are granted and earned by these companies, grants, loans, agreements, have been occurring for decades. So hasn't the general public been investing in space knowledge and space information over the years? That's a question that I've been thinking about and asking myself. And what about the issue of radioactive waste? What about the issue of interfering with natural orbits and what that may cause? What about forward, backward radiation? These are concerns that have been articulated within the international community. Do we have any proofs that any of those things would happen? We're living in an interesting time where you all as students, you get to consider these messy, seemingly disparate phenomena, and you get to understand, advise, and consult with people as you start to learn more and more about what you would like to see happen, how to make those things happen. These are bits and pieces of information from history that I've gathered up that I'm presenting that you can use in your own decision-making process when it becomes relevant for you. Something I'd like for you to remember, there was a time during the period known as the Cold War where there was an ideological battle which constantly was brought up in decisions to go to war, decisions to take certain actions or not, and it was framed in terms of communism versus capitalism. And there was a battle, a world conflict inspired by these competing ideologies. Around 1991, some people say 1989, but somewhere in that period, there was a shift, and we moved out of the Cold War era into the post-Cold War era. And many discourses arise during that period saying, okay, capitalism won the Cold War, the Soviet Union is no more, we don't have to worry about the communist threat, quote unquote. Now is the time to shift outer space development in the free market direction, okay? These discourses still seem to be powerful. They were underlying some of the sentiments expressed during the 2004 President on Moon, Mars, and Beyond Commission hearings, which took place in 5 different cities in the United States. 96 witnesses were asked to come and testify, basically about what needed to happen for the future of the U.S. space program. And you can research, there's a website, and these transcripts from these various hearings are still available for you to view, and you can see what the people were testifying to, things that they wanted to see happen, okay? And basically, overwhelmingly, most people said they would like to see the private sector take over more of the NASA space transportation activities, more activities in general. And the belief was that space could happen in a sustained way if the private sector would be allowed to take it over. Things would happen faster, safer, and cheaper if you open it up to free market competition. That's just a snapshot, a summary of the overall feeling that was put forth in these discourses, published hearing transcripts during the commission hearings. So still today, when you research the issue of whether or not international space law is sufficient for new industries, you get a feel for this debate, which is still sort of hidden and embedded in this current legal argument. To deconstruct that argument, to give you some things to begin to think about, is there really a distinction to be drawn between private space activities and government space activities? Think about it. Many private companies are funded by NASA, research and development funds or public funds, taxpayer dollars, okay? Technology transfers, knowledge built up over decades is often transferred to companies who can show they have the wherewithal to do something with those technologies. The point that I'm making here is those are really public assets. Res communis, that's a principle which is embedded in the Outer Space Treaty and all of the space treaties. This principle basically says, here's the book. How many of you have seen the treaties, the 5 space treaties? Has anyone actually read the treaties? Yeah, of course you have. He's my best student in the class, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, oh, you have too? Okay, all right. Anybody else? I'm going to pass this around. And I had to go all the way to Vienna to get that in 2002. I had to go to the United Nations Office of Outer Space Affairs and speak with the head of the legal subcommittee. Now it's all online, okay? And you can actually pull up the treaties, and they're published in 6 different languages. But they're all available online now, so you can actually see for yourself what the treaties say. In a nutshell, shortly after the launching of Sputnik in 1957, President Eisenhower of the United States and various other leaders of nations, they wrote correspondence to the United Nations and pointed out the urgency of creating laws to govern this territory known as outer space. This resulted in approximately 10 years of negotiations with over 100 nations and institutions. And a decision was made that the territory known as outer space, which begins approximately 100 kilometers or 62 miles above Earth's atmosphere, that territory was deemed and agreed to become res communis territory. Now, what does that mean? Well, it's just a fancy way to say a commons area. Here's Earth. Let's say 100 kilometers is here. The international community agreed that from here beyond would be res communis. Belonging to no one, therefore belonging to everyone. The point being, everyone should have the freedom to explore or use it, but no one should have the right to exclude others from exploring and using any part of outer space or its resources. That was the agreement. The satellite industry was sort of in reliance on that happening, because otherwise nations could have argued that they did in fact own not only their sovereign territory and their airspace, but they could have arguably said, we also own any part of outer space that's above our territory. This issue was settled by the international community with the res communis doctrine, and this is there throughout the Outer Space Treaty. The feeling and sentiment that outer space should be shared by all humankind. I'd like to point out a few more things before I end and open it for questions. In addition to international space law, it was decided that matters of commercialization and industry would be within the domestic lawmaking sphere. In other words, the international community not only agreed to res communis, but they also agreed that when it comes to commercialization issues, industry formation, etc., the nations could pass their own commercialization laws. So we see a series of activities, the 1962 ComSat Act, we see Intelsat and Marsat, the Orbit Act, numerous laws and policies passed during President Reagan's administration, and we see many industries forming around laws. U.S. has a pattern of trend setting when it comes to commercialization, laws, practices, and industry creation. I haven't seen any dissent to satellite telecommunications, remote sensing, space transportation, private space transportation industries. Many space lawyers affiliated with the UN and the IISL are of the opinion that space law, therefore, is sufficient, both the international as well as the domestic space laws, primarily because of the domestic space law when it comes to commercialization, is sufficient for industries such as space mining, space transportation, even private space transportation, space settlements. However, there seems to be a fear that memories from the past, injustices, inequality, colonization, failed development scenarios are going to blow this whole thing once it kicks off. But people aren't specifically saying that. Instead, they're pointing to the Outer Space Treaty or the Moon Treaty, and they're complaining that something's wrong with those international treaties. So I'd like to leave you with some ideas. Taxes, tithing, philanthropy, mission statements, visions of caring, concerned, civilized organizations, corporate giving, sponsorship, enlightenment for the world to see, helping our fellow humans, helping with development and modernization, improving health, welfare, safety, being good citizens, doing to others as you would have them do unto you, etc., etc., etc. Our world is full of those as our norms, standards through which modernized societies tend to live by, people tend to abide by and respect, etc. And then you saw in the two videos, key actors within the companies, they're saying, as we develop space, and as we mine these asteroids, we're going to make sure that all humanity benefits. People often ask about the Moon Treaty and the Outer Space Treaty, and there's a lot of confusion. There's something called the Common Heritage of Mankind principle. This is considered problematic by some people, confusing to other people. The Common Heritage of Mankind principle is not in the Outer Space Treaty of 1967. I pass it around as an exhibit. You all can examine it. Instead, there's a phrase called the Province of Mankind principle that's in the Outer Space Treaty. When the Outer Space Treaty opened for signature in 1967, it was signed by approximately 96 nations and ratified, and then it was signed by an additional 27 or so nations. In other words, in international relations talk, that's a huge amount of widespread international acceptance for a treaty. So it's considered good law. It's considered the Constitution for outer space. The Moon Treaty, however, it took 5 years to get just 5 nations to sign. And because those 5 nations weren't to sign and ratify and deposit it with the UN, okay? Because those 5 nations were not spacefaring powers, many people have argued that the Moon Treaty is failed, it's not valid. However, the distinction is this. Within the Moon Treaty itself, it did not require that the signatories be the spacefaring nations. The Outer Space Treaty did require, the Outer Space Treaty required the US, the Soviet Union, and Great Britain. They had to sign and ratify it and other steps before that treaty could become valid law, and it did become valid law. The Moon Treaty, however, it was agreed upon by the international community during the negotiations that what this treaty would need in order to go into effect was 5 nations, any 5 nations, to sign, and it did secure those 5 signatures. It took 5 years to do it, but it did secure those 5 signatures. Therefore, in accordance with the international space law community, as far as many of them are concerned, that treaty was enacted. Now, it lacks international broad acceptance, but it did gain the legally required consensus, okay? And I know that's confusing. Now, what was wrong with the Moon Treaty? Well, complaints were made about the Common Heritage of Mankind principle. Some people did not like that. They felt it was unrealistic, that it was socialist, and that that was bad. Another objection to the treaty that came out in discourses, there was opposition to the treaty within the U.S. government, and some of these opposing statements included comments like, well, people who are taking the risk should be those who benefit, and we shouldn't have to share profits with the international community, statements like that. Another reason for objection of the Moon Treaty was it was thought to ban private enterprise development and to chill business investors. Those were the key reasons that the Moon Treaty was not accepted within the U.S. It wasn't accepted within the Soviet Union either, or various other countries. But it seems to, in recent years, it seems to be gaining more acceptance. Now, how do you know which nations signed these 5 treaties? Well, there's a UN website where you can pull up each of the treaties, and you can check on the status of each treaty to figure out which country signed it, when they signed it, how many countries signed it. It's one thing to sign a treaty, but in order for it to go into effect, nations have to sign it and then ratify it also, okay? But this is the website. You can search United Nations Office for Outer Space Affairs. It's unoosa.org, and it has a treaty bank there. Okay. Here it is. Here are the various treaties listed. These are the working papers if you want to see what the various arguments were which led to the terms which eventually went into the final treaties. That's all there available on the UN website. Now, the reason I pointed out the difference between the Outer Space and the Moon Treaty is those two IISL Board of Directors statements that I pulled up. I see them as trying to fill in that gray area between the two treaties somehow. Again, it's messy, so my presentation was essentially to admit to you that some things in our world aren't really known. Some things are at the opinion and varying perspective phase. And this is where this current issue over asteroid mining stands currently. What's the solution? A colleague asked me, what's the solution to all this? So my solution is outer space diplomacy. Did anybody see this video on the internet? The caption said, North Korea released this video today. Did anybody, I'll just play this for a minute and then I'm gonna open this up to questions. The point that I wanna make here is international relations is realpolitik. Wars are expensive, they don't work. Parties usually end up at the negotiating table after wars fail and all the money is spent, lives are lost. Outer space development, prosperity, wealth creation, beauty, opportunity, technology, advanced enlightened thinking, challenging people to use more than 1/10% of the brain, applied intelligence, applied genius, it's resources and solutions to solve all the world's problems can happen if the global community, if everyone could only see this vision that I have for outer space development. I'm going to play this video. It's disturbing. Okay, I'm not condoning the video. I'd like to condemn it. But I'm tired of war. I'm tired of these conflicts. I'm tired of nations threatening each other. I'd like to see all of us move into a modern era. And for me, there's nothing else except for outer space development. Thank you very much. Are there any questions?
Any questions for Dr. Weeks? Yes, Corey.
What happens if the treaty's broken?
Well, what does it mean to you that a treaty, how would you know that a treaty is broken?
I don't know, I guess you're the expert. Because, I mean, having treaties, the United States and the Native Americans, I mean, I think there's a lot of breaking of treaties there. So what happens if, you know, a spacefaring nation breaks a treaty?
I think you know the answer to that. What's the answer to that?
Nothing.
Nothing?
Well, I don't know how a non-space...
Concern.
Yeah, concerns.
What's that concern? What could happen if a treaty is broken? What is your concern?
Distrust, you know, could lead to, I guess, war in the future.
Mm-hmm. What I call it brewing resentments.
Sure.
Because people know, I think when the insurgency happened, and everybody knows what I mean when I say insurgency, right?
No, I don't.
Okay. Well, the war in Afghanistan and Iraq, there were these, people were creating these improvised explosive devices to fight the U.S. military, okay? U.S. military, I believe, is the most powerful military on earth. But it didn't win those two wars. And not only that, but people with little or no money were creating powerful weapons and fighting against this military superpower. So I've thought about that, what was fueling this resentment, and what I've come up with is something that I call brewing resentments. And what it looks like is when people intergenerationally, they start talking about issues and discussing what went wrong, what's happening, disappointments. So it can turn into that because grandmothers, grandfathers, they remember when treaties were negotiated into and what the terms were, and they can see whether or not it's real. And people talk about things. Even everyday people, we may not assume are knowledgeable or political. They talk about their real life and how things are faring and what they expected from people who made certain promises. Whether we call them treaties or gentlemen's agreements or promises of employment, etc., I think you risk brewing resentments. The Arab Spring rising is a good example of how if populations do not feel that elected officials have their best interests at heart, elected officials can lose their positions of power because the people do ultimately have power when they decide to. So that's what I think can happen if treaties are broken. But usually, very few people even know about the existence of treaties. If you think about it, the people in this room had never seen any of these treaties, and the treaties are old now. They're from the 60s and 70s. And so just imagine people around the world probably haven't seen the treaties either. So do people even know that the treaties exist? Do people even know that they've been given legal rights as heirs in common to this whole outer space territory? Like, say your grandfather, if a relative passed away and left you $1 million, if the attorneys didn't notify you that that right to you was in the will, you wouldn't know it, right? You have to be notified. So how can people in the world benefit? How can everybody in the world benefit from outer space development if most of the world isn't even aware that outer space is being developed?
Is an infinite time, impeding upon the time of progress, I think would be a commercialization argument, right?
Or just to feel good. I think it's time for people to feel good. And I think outer space, if key strategists, I believe, should start using outer space to make people feel good. And then I think enough people will start being inspired to actually live dreams. And then that can fuel a critical mass of people doing more positive things. So even if it starts initially as a strategy, I think it can turn into something really great. And it's at a time when there's nothing else. Factory jobs are not dependable anymore. Factories are shutting down. People are unsure. Like, you're all probably uncertain what's going to happen when you finish your degree. People can design positive futures for themselves by linking themselves to things that are likely to work. And right now, outer space, whether it's space mining, space transportation, locating a habitable planet, and all the things that people will need as those activities are occurring. In FDR's time, jobs were created, skyscrapers were built, new industries were formed around the building of skyscrapers. Minneapolis, I came through Minneapolis on my way here. I was impressed by all those skyscrapers. Sometimes that's enough to trigger people to dream and to pursue things and to make things happen. So I don't know. I'm not a I don't read tea leaves. Who's the next question? No, did that answer your question? Kind of, sort of.
Yeah.
Okay.
The argument, I guess, is just we don't have, if we don't do it in a certain time frame, we might not have resources to do it in the next time frame. So how do we speed that along is more or less what I was trying to get to.
By speaking to it, I think people can find ways to generate public interest, news shows, documentaries, reality TV shows, whatever it is that people normally do to get people to thinking about things. You can call a meeting with Congress and the Senate and speak to certain issues. The time is now. We must immediately.
To add to that really quick while you're saying that, what do you think about having STEM people in politics and have lawyers advise us as opposed to the other way around?
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. I think everyone should become interdisciplinary. My hope in presenting this to you STEMS people today is to give you permission to become a legal researcher, a policy analyst, a political science thinker, and international relations perspective type person. But I'm also teaching social and behavioral sciences students that they have permission to learn about the STEMS things, to go ahead and figure out things that are happening in the hard sciences. I think to convince whole generations of people that they have, if you like history, just focus on history and that's it. I think all these things are linked. In order to understand any one phenomena, we should understand the whole. If we're only using 1/10 of our brain, let's open it up. Let's all, from the time of our birth, be encouraged to use everything we have and to learn everything about everything. That's what I think. I think people spend a lot of time daydreaming or vegetating or in front of the TV. I think it's time for us to live and be geniuses. And any more questions? Yes.
Go. All right. Actually, Dave, you better go. I have a question in several parts.
Okay. Is anybody, do you know of now, about either those two companies that you mentioned or anybody else working to change international law or domestic law?
Working to change international law.
To fit more towards privatizing.
The efforts that I've witnessed in the past have included people presenting papers to the International Institute of Space Law, people writing articles, people testifying to Congress and the Senate that space law needs to be changed, that more specific terms need to. And then in the President's Commission report, I think it was page 32, of 2004, it specifically stated that private property rights should be allowed for people who will go out and develop the final frontier. It says something like that. It has the term private property rights, but it's sort of tricky. It also says in accordance with international law, and since international law is claimed to be vague, that could possibly be a problem. So there's some minor sort of subtle efforts, hearing transcripts. Many statements were made requesting private property rights, but private property rights aren't really necessary other than the imagined likelihood or possibility that people may one day complain. So you mean any form, is that a good enough?
Yeah, then it comes up to a follow-up question with them. What are the actors that are trying to do this? Like, is it the companies that I mentioned, or is there other players out there trying to do that? Is there changing in the White House? Because you mentioned the commission tried to do that. So where is this change coming from?
Okay. And that's an excellent question. I embarked on a journey in 2002 to try to answer that very question. And I interviewed the head of the legal subcommittee within the United Nations Committee on Peaceful Use of Outer Space. And he basically told me that opinion that space law is fine. It doesn't need to be changed. Commercialization is perfectly fine the way space laws are right now. I asked if there was something in the works within the United Nations to change the Outer Space Treaty or the space law. He said, no, there's nothing in the works. I'm not finding anything at the authoritative level within the international community to place on the agenda a change in the space treaties. I'm just finding discourses within hearings before the Senate subcommittee, the congressional subcommittee. There are little mentions requesting private property rights, that something be done to grant them. But in terms of it being placed on the agenda at the international level, other than the International Astronautical Federation congresses in the form of papers and discussions, I'm not seeing any official efforts at the international level. I think it's a sensitive topic. I think there's a feeling of not wanting to rock the boat because there's this imagined international resentment or jealousy or fears or past feelings of resentment or
In other words, if you're trying to say that if there was a company, so say from Europe or from Asia, that wanted to capitalize on asteroid mining, then it would be more okay than just the U.S. trying to do it?
Well, I don't know. I think the people who have requested, whether it's in an article posted on the internet or in a National Space Society meeting or in a hearing transcript presented to the Congress, or the mention of needing private property rights, it's not expressly being stated that the fear is that the U.S. is sort of resented right now. I'm not seeing that as specific as that. But I think you're onto something there with that assumption. In terms of international relations theory, there's something called a unipolar power. And the United States right now seems to be in the position of a unipower. There's no longer a bipolar balance of power, so the United States seems to be the unipower. It's the nation that many people are addressing concerns to and complaints to in its position of the unipower. So based upon that analysis, I would say US-based companies, let's say they do mine platinum group metals and make $1,000 trillion, and that hits the news, the global news. I think it's likely that that can get connected to other discourses that are out there right now, where people are complaining about the U.S. I don't see as many people complaining about Japan or France. Maybe if I go to those nations, I'll see complaints about them, but I just don't know if the United States has a higher level of complaints being lodged at it ideologically in conversations, fussing. I would imagine it does because of the position that it's held up to on the world stage. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does.
And it's messy. I'm going to be thinking about that.
Think of that what, like about in the 90s, I heard the expression that all the other countries just wanted NASA to succeed. They feel like they didn't have to develop their own space stuff. Everything was going on in NASA, and internationals could go work at NASA, so there was no loss of trying to get involved in the space race.
Your instinct, what you're doing, you're using an instinct, and you're trying to figure out the words. You're absolutely correct. That hunch that you have that the United States, it is viewed as a leader when it comes to space activities. NASA is held as a champion. People still talk about President Kennedy and the space program with a great amount of respect and admiration. And NASA's accomplishments. So many people within the international community, they've told me, your government spends 6 times all the other nations combined on its space program. I was in France I was presenting a paper at the International Space University in Strasbourg, France, and while I was there, I traveled around some. I had my 8-year-old son with me. We went to an Air and Space Museum in Paris, and the aviation devices from antiquity were there, and everything was written in France, and the credits were given to the French inventors. And I thought to myself, oh my goodness, I didn't know the French people were so instrumental in aviation. Oh, they're so French-centric. Why don't they mention any other Americans? Right, so I was going through this nationalistic discourse in my head, telling my son this, we're Americans. So then I got to the part where Charles Lindbergh, okay, they had a huge display about Charles Lindbergh's transatlantic flight. And I thought, in the middle of all this French-centric exhibit, display, they give such honor to Charles Lindbergh. Wow, they're really fair. They had to give credit where it's due. Hey, son, we're American. Look at this Charles Lindbergh. So I told them all about it. I was proud to be an American, right? Then we walked further into this museum, and there were the 3 astronauts, the Apollo mission, the landing of the moon, and it was this huge room. They were paying homage, and the ceiling was even higher, everything. I said, son, see, we're American, NASA, right? And this, in my experience, the people that I've interacted with since 2002 at the space conferences at the international level, there tends to be a great amount of respect for NASA, U.S. leadership, etc. But with that comes pointing the finger and disgruntlement You all are supposed to do something. You all said we're all going to benefit. When is that going to happen? We're not benefiting. You guys are benefiting. When are we going to benefit? So there's a responsibility also with this Disneyland, Michael Jackson type cultural influence. There's a responsibility at this point in history when so many things are failing. Our school systems are failing. Our economy has failed. People are looking for the next big thing. And I think space development can be it, but it must happen in a way where more people around the world can truly benefit in ways that are meaningful to them and their kids and their grandkids in order for the whole thing to work, and in order for the geniuses that are needed to invent key pieces that are missing in technology to be called forth. We have to include more people. That's what I think. Yes.
All right. This question comes to you from some of our online students. They're interested in knowing that given the spirit of res communists, the prevailing spirit of res communists, did the IISL provide any explanation or justification for their opposing statement in their 2009 bullet that you noted in your presentation?
You mean the 2004, that caveat clause?
It was a 2009 statement, I believe.
The opposition?
It was a IISL interpretation that said that private companies would basically be ordained property rights.
No. It said they were prohibited. Both statements said property rights are not allowable by either states or private entities.
All right. Well, perhaps I'm misinterpreting that.
Okay.
Assuming that there is a loophole, though, that does permit private companies to claim rights on the moon, what mechanism for arbitration exists for bilateral or multilateral disputes?
Well, first of all, I know what the person seems to be referring to, the caveat clause in the 2004 statement, the clause that said, however, if I had the energy, I'd hop up, find it, pop it back up. But I'm spent, folks. You guys have milked me to the core, but it's good. Okay. All right. I think they're referring to the caveat statement that I said could be used as a loophole to give companies the feeling that they have permission to carry out whatever activities they were carrying out. Okay. Because I also said that was July of 2004, and shortly after that, the Commercial Launch Space Amendments Act of 2004 was passed. So I think that's what the student is referring to, whether or not that clause somehow opened up rights, and if those rights were to become controversial, whether or not there's an arbitration mechanism. Not that I'm aware of. There's a scholar named Geraldine Go who did her dissertation topic on suggesting a model for arbitration and disputes as they relate to outer space. The UN model is there. There's that mechanism, and it worked very well. I don't really understand the criticism because it's been successful. They were successful in creating and negotiating 4, arguably 5 international treaties, which have been very successful. And if you look at the history of space activities, I also don't know why people act as if space has failed. Humankind has made incredible strides. All of the programs, all of the inventions, all of the technologies, you know, the internet, to me that's a huge success. We couldn't have the internet if it weren't for satellites which have been launched into outer space. So is there a formal arbitration mechanism somewhere out there for claims of private property rights? Yes. The United Nations, the International Institute of Space Law, the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, they've been in effect for several decades now.
And is that mechanism similar to what the International Telecommunication Union currently uses?
That's a good question. I'd say yes, it's similar because it's agreed upon by the international community. The International Telecommunications Union in 1988 agreed to like an orbital slot allocation mechanism through which the countries which were members of the ITU were given certain rights to slots in the geostationary orbit. Okay, that's right, geostationary orbit, right. And that seemed to have worked just fine. It was peaceable. Nations agreed to it. Even nations that didn't have the technology to put their satellite up, they had the right to lease the space out and to create revenues for their nation. So I haven't heard many complaints. I actually haven't heard any complaints about that procedure. So yes, I would say it's very similar in that it's international and it's based upon international community agreement and cooperation.
All right, and final question. Assuming that I own a private startup that's going to be mining resources on the moon, and the country that I'm launching from grants me a launch license and doesn't regulate my conduct while I'm in outer space.
Wait. All of that? Okay.
Presuming
doesn't
that
regulate my conduct while I'm in outer space?
the FAA currently has jurisdiction for launch and reentry licensing, but what I do while I'm in space is largely unregulated, with some caveats, including
State Department specifically.
State Department, my conduct in space. Yeah. The government's responsible for my conduct in space, but they can't tell me how to conduct myself while I'm in space unless they precondition that.
Well,
anyway. So my point is the international community going to have a problem with my government or with me for not sharing the resources I extract?
Okay. Oh, for not, so this is all, it gets down to whether or not.
Yeah, Somalia gave me a launch license. I went to the moon and I extracted a quadrillion tons of platinum.
Yeah.
I'm not sharing it with anyone. Do people have a problem with Somalia or do they have a problem with me?
With Somalia?
The country that gave me the launch license.
Yeah, okay. I was misunderstanding up until the point, the very last three words. I thought where the question was going was, can I do anything that I want, and if I get up there and mess up somehow and cause an environmental disaster or something, would the international community have a problem with the launching state, or would it have a problem with me?
Well, I'd have a problem with both of you. But my question is,
right.
In the case specifically of resource extraction, because there's some case law or precedent for the other thing.
Okay, right. Okay, so you got me there. Okay, so now I have to reprocess my answer, which I was formulating while you were asking that long question. So tell me simply, what is the question? What's the bottom line?
Resources from the moon.
Mm-hmm. Oh, from the moon?
From any celestial body, it doesn't matter.
Let's say from an asteroid, a near-Earth asteroid. Okay, all right.
I bring it back, and I deposit the wealth into a bank account of my own, and
in which country?
Switzerland. It doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. But then, a coalition of nations decide that I have transgressed because the 67 space law says that I need to share the wealth with humanity. Mm. Do they take that out with the country that gave me the launch license, or am I never allowed to leave the country I'm in or risk, being dragged to The Hague?
Okay. Let me answer your question with a question. What if you go and mine gold and whole platinum group metals, and your conquest is worth $1,000 trillion on the global market, okay, from mining. And you launch from Somalia. You put the money, the profits, in a Swiss bank account. What if no one from the international community said anything about that? What if they applauded what you did? Then what would you do?
Well, they would probably have a problem with me polluting the entire world's money supply with $1 quadrillion, but...
But how do you know?
Because it would devalue, it would cause hyperinflation for the entire global economy.
What if Americans had a problem with what you did, and what if they complained against you? Then what would you do?
Then I would have plenty of money to protect myself in litigation.
What if your friends and your colleagues here, what if they had a problem with you and they sent you mean emails saying, how could you do that? And why won't you share it with the university? And you got your knowledge from here, and what would you do?
Well, I would say that lots of people have a problem with the work that Exxon does every day, but it doesn't stop them from making record profits quarter after quarter.
But
I mean, business is business. Am I going to get away with this or not?
I don't know. I don't read tea leaves.
Okay. I mean, that's a fair enough answer.
Talking about a tea leaf. I don't know.
I read tea leaves. If it's really Somalia, they'll go after you.
So there's no government. Yeah.
If it's the United States,
Yeah.
they'll go after the United States. Okay? And the United States would probably go after you. Unless there's a Bush 3.
But you wouldn't go to jail, so that's good.
And in that example, I had 10 times the value of the U.S. GDP in my bank account, so.
We'll make those, what is it, $1 trillion coins?
Yeah.
Now, if you had a close friend who was an attorney, you know what that friend might advise you to do? The friend might advise you, they might say, you know what you should do? Just to make sure you don't have any problems, you should donate some of that money to the United Nations. You know, of $1,000 trillion, you should donate 1 trillion, just 1 trillion, that's all. You'll still have 999 trillion. You should donate 1 trillion to the United Nations and then a million to UND.
There's a law against that.
I'll consult my publicist, I guess, and PR firm. Is there a law against donating? Oh, it can be construed as a bribe.
Yeah, that's a bribe.
Yeah.
Well,
It could be construed as a bribe.
or giving, corporate giving. Yeah, corporate giving. There's something called tithing, corporate giving, taxes. There's something called grants and community.
Legal layers of that issue, what you are talking about. But think about the legal issues also. Mafia.
The what? I'm sorry. Yeah.
You think it doesn't exist in this world?
I have friends.
No, it's just
I know someone.
Yes.
Lavelle? Yeah, it's a more technical question. There have been a number of incidences over the last few years where a person or a group has claimed to have ownership of, for example, the lunar surface or 433 Eros.
Yes.
When they tried to charge NASA for parking fees for having the spacecraft on it.
Yes.
I mean, most of those got thrown out, I think, based on the idea that you can't have ownership or access or claim or control or whatever without physically having access. In the old days, you used to go out and have to stake out the land that you had claimed. Is that likely to be a criteria that's used in future? For example, there are literally millions of asteroids of useful size in nearest space. Well, if you want to use this one or that one, will it require that you have the ability to access it before you can make any preemptive claim to it?
Well, again, the Outer Space Treaty prohibits that type of exclusive claim of ownership right. Because when you stick a stake in there, now, as I understand it, the Apollo astronauts stuck a flag on the moon, okay, and people bring that up. But according to international space law, no nation, no person, no company can claim that right, whether you stick a stake on it or from a distance, give a person a certificate saying they own it. All of those activities are prohibited according to the powers that be, the legal governing authorities that have been commissioned to give opinions on space law and to interpret the treaty.
I guess I would rephrase the question a little bit and say, could you use it legitimately if you can gain access to it without actually owning it? So it's not it's a matter of whether ownership versus utilization.
Yes, you do have the freedom. You as an individual would have the freedom to use those resources in any way that you decide you want to use them. If you want to remotely mine them with the Razor robot or something, say NASA gives you the Razor robot, it's working.
Accessing it. Yeah.
Yes, you have the freedom to use. Now, use hasn't actually officially been defined yet, but again, that was sort of left up to individuals as we develop and The framers of the space treaties were trying to get these treaties signed so they could have some sort of law to prevent World War III from occurring in outer space. That was the main thing on their mind at the time. So the best way to describe the key actors in my dissertation, I created 3 frames, 3 historical period reference points where I observed shifts happening in terms of who the key actors were, the types of activities that they did, the types of results which occurred. So during the first epoch of outer space development, the key actors, as I saw them, or as I described them in my dissertation, were the US, the Soviet Union. Then who was the third actor? Who was the third actor? The third actor I described as the international community acting through the mechanism of the United Nations. So that's sort of how the power seemed to be distributed. And that international community, they had power in terms of one superpower or the other losing that as an ally. So that was the power that the international community had. They seemed content at that time just to get those 2 superpowers to sign some type of treaty. And if you look at the treaty, and I think it's still floating around, some of the primary concerns was that the moon would not be used to put weapons of mass destruction. There would be no nuclear weapons placed in outer space. So people, they were freshly out of World War II. And that meant a lot. World War II was so devastating for so many people that many decisions regarding space law were shaped out of an honest desire not to want to see another world war happen. World wars were expensive. They destroyed people. People felt like instead of blowing up cities and towns, we could have been building things. So there was a genuine sentiment to try and do whatever they could to prevent another war. But they also didn't want to restrict activities, visionaries, inventors, explorers. They didn't want to restrict that. So that clause, all nations, all people have the freedom to use and explore outer space. So what your attorney would argue is that he has the right to do whatever he wants because he has the freedom to use space. Someone else might argue, oh, his use, he's mined so much of that asteroid, there's nothing left. Therefore, he has claimed exclusive ownership right over it by the level of his use. Then your attorney would say, yeah, but you all didn't say that.
Here's the $10 million check to NPI.
Yeah, and I'd like to contribute, yes. And I'd like to thank and we do it all the time. I remember when Warren Buffett, do you all remember when Warren Buffett reportedly gave $32 billion to the Bill and Linda Gates Foundation? This was during the high time when I was working on my dissertation, and my sister had asked me, she said, well, what are some of the richest people in the world doing? Are they involved with this? So I looked up a list of the richest people in the world. I searched that, figured out who they were. Then I searched their names to see if they were affiliated with space. And that's when I found out about Warren Buffett giving $32 billion to the Bill and Linda Gates Foundation. And that made me feel really good about philanthropy and life and wealth. And what I found as I get older is that there are people in the world who make a lot of money, and then they turn around and they really want to do and they want to give. And they make positive changes. Libraries.
Carnegie.
There are so many good, and we should teach more classes on what people have done with their money because, and often there's a tax benefit involved with giving. Often there's a feel-good benefit. Sometimes people give money and then they wind up making more money just because they gave money. So that's a real thing that happens. I think more of that will happen. Millionaires used to be a big deal to be a millionaire. The richest people in the world, I remember when they were millionaires. $100,000 candy bar was exciting to me as a kid because that meant you were rich. There's a TV show called The $6 Million Man, and most of us didn't even know how to write out millions at that time because millions was such that drew people to watch. $6 million man, wow! And then we went to sleep and woke up, and somehow the richest people in the world were billionaires. And nobody explained the shift or that it was coming or what it meant, but many people became billionaires during the dot-com revolution, the internet, and the access to and globalization. So perhaps we're at the eve of people becoming multi-trillionaires. If that happens, I really believe that more people with more wealth will do more good things for the world, grants for students such as yourself, jobs, more universities could be built to teach people about space, and the international community could be invited more often to pursue degrees in this. I think that would be cherished for generations to come. And that's what I would like to see happen. The videos from the two companies are suggesting that this is what they want to see happen. And perhaps this is the direction that humankind will finally go in, instead of I'm tired of wars. And
I can't help but thinking of Carnegie, who was a total scumbag in life and in business, and yet he come forward as a very positive image as a result of his libraries and museums and such. But you know, you can buy your way out of hell, I think.
Well,
It's to die poor.
yeah, I haven't really researched Carnegie. All I really know about him is the library phenomena. And that's how I got my start. And my encouragement was in the public library in downtown St. Louis. And it always amazed me that I could walk in there with no money and read and rent books and ask them to purchase books so I could copy and make notes to myself. And that was a life changer for me. Did that answer your question, though?
Yes, yes. Yeah.
Okay, all right. And there was somebody else.
Cassandra.
Yes, Cassandra.
We probably better.
Oh, is it it?
Here.
Okay.
Cassandra, maybe you can ask her afterwards.
Okay, all right.
So let's thank our speaker again. That there's dinner tonight at 7:30 at Mama Maria's. So you can ask Dr. Weeks more questions. Also, there will be a special colloquium this week, Friday, 4 p.m. Joanne Kabrinowitz will be speaking. So have a nice evening. Hope to see you at dinner.
Thank you.